All right, welcome to Boundless Accelerator Presents Toolkit Tuesday. We have a brand new look and feel today. My name is Temi Orekoya. I'm the Startup Program Manager here at Boundless Accelerator, and I'm happy to be here with you for this session. I'd like first to welcome our American Sign Language interpreters whose time today is graciously provided in kind by Assign. Jennifer and Samantha. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you to Assign. Please feel free to spotlight the ASL interpreter if you need to. Thank you as well to Alex Miller, our program coordinator at Boundless Accelerator, who is supporting all behind the scenes and Zoom webinar elements with us today. While I'm at it, I would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Danby, Synergenics, and Invest in Guelph. We are very grateful for their support in all we do. Before beginning the session today, I would like to first give recognition to the land that Guelph is on. We acknowledge that many others here today may be on a different territory, so we invite and encourage each of you to give recognition to the land you occupy today and every day. As we gather for today's event, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As people who work and live on this land, we are responsible for its continued stewardship. Today, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabeg peoples on whose traditional territory we are meeting. Today's webinar is called Privacy 101, What Every Startup Should Know Now and Plan For Later, and will be presented by Susie Hendrie and Monifa Brooks from Garabyte. But first, in case some of you are new to Boundless Accelerator, here's a very quick history lesson. Boundless Accelerator was established in 2010 as Innovation Guelph and is one of 17 regional innovation centers in Ontario. We are proud to share with you that we won many awards for our leadership in advancing Canadian entrepreneurship across the country. Yes, country. While we are located in Guelph, Ontario, we serve the entire region of Southern Ontario and have one national program. This means that while most of our clients are located within the Toronto to Waterloo corridor, we do have clients in BC, all the way to Nova Scotia, and throughout most of Ontario. We work with our clients, supporting them throughout multiple stages of business growth, from startup to scale up, with many programs and workshops, networking opportunities, and professional introductions. Recently, we introduced a brand new consulting division for larger startups with over $1 million in annual revenue. However, this information is on our website, boundlessaccelerator.ca. You can visit it anytime. Today, we're here not to listen to me, but to hear from two very interesting presenters, whom I would like to introduce you all to now. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's expert presenters, Susie Hendrie and Monifa Brooks. Susie is driven by finding innovative ways to ensure organizations meet their regulatory and compliance requirements while maximizing the value of data. For more than 2 decades, she has supported organizations as they navigate the intersection between privacy, technology, regulation, and public policy. Monifa has spent nearly 2 decades developing skills in data privacy, regulatory compliance, risk management, and process improvement. Her diverse background and range of skills have honed her ability to provide practical guidance to help organizations operationalize privacy. Should you have any questions for Susie or Monifa today during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature or the chat box, and we will monitor and ask your questions when the right moment appears during the session or at the end, as time allows. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started. Over to you, Susie and Monifa.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here today. So thank you everyone who has given us their lunch break to join in to learn more about privacy. You're doing the right thing. This is going to be hopefully well worth the hour that you are going to give us today. Privacy is something that Monifa and I are very passionate about. So much so that almost 2 years ago, she and I set up Garabyte Consulting, and we exist to help organizations manage and build privacy management programs. And today we're going to share our insights on the topic. We're very mindful that we are speaking to a startup community. So the things that we're sharing with you today are being shared with that in mind, knowing that startups have many pressures and priorities and also limited budgets. But at this point in time, privacy is not a nice to have. It really is a must have. And of course, today we're going to be focusing on what a business needs to do when it comes to privacy, as opposed to looking at consumer privacy issues, because that is a whole other topic unto itself. So I'll hand over to Monifa, who's going to run through the agenda. And again, thank you for having us here today. Mute. I think you're on mute.
I should know that by now. We've been living in this digital space for long enough for me to make sure I always check the mute button. But thank you, Susie. Today's agenda, we're going to be covering privacy basics, laws and regulations, privacy in the workplace, the building blocks of a privacy program. We'll also provide you key takeaways, and we're looking forward to the question and answer period. We'll also share some further resources if you want to, spend your time like we do, reading up on data privacy. Over to you, Susie.
Thanks, Monifa. So it used to be when we talked about privacy, people would respond and say, oh, we can go back, yeah, privacy basics. People would say, oh, I have nothing to hide. I don't really care about my privacy. But I haven't heard that in a long time. With the introduction of biometrics, facial recognition, alongside the increase in privacy breaches, people seem to care a lot more about their privacy now, and that's a good thing. In fact, in recent data that came out of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, it's the federal regulator, privacy in Canada, 93% of Canadians said they had some concerns over their privacy. And as we live so much of our lives online in the digital world, privacy is even more important. So when we're talking about privacy, the first thing to level set from my perspective is understanding what personal information is. And the short form for us sort of privacy nerds for personal information is PI. So if I refer to PI, I will try not to, but if I do, that is what we're referring to. So what is personal information? Often personal information, or the definition, is misunderstood, or people don't appreciate how broad a definition of personal information is. It is anything from the basics like your date of birth, your home address, your social insurance number, your email address, And it incorporates more things like your political opinions or beliefs, your details of your resume, banking information, your internet IP address, to things even like your headshot and your photograph that appear online. So really, the best way to think about personal information is it's any information, any data point that identifies who you specifically are. And as we've seen through countless privacy breaches, personal information is something that needs to be protected and safeguarded. However, I'm just going to pause for a moment and say something that I think sometimes confuses people, and I want to clarify that. Personal information isn't necessarily private information. So as we sit here today, you can see my face, you can see my name, so that's not private, although it is personal information. However, just because personal information is widely available, it doesn't mean that it can be used for any purpose. And I think that it's sort of extra relevant when it comes to maybe small businesses when they're hiring and they're tempted to possibly look at someone's social media profile. And this is something we'll delve into in a bit more detail. But I think just to say that, businesses really need to think about how they're using and processing personal information for many reasons. And I think we'll move to the next slide now to talk about why privacy is important. So now that we've level setted on what personal information is, we're going to talk a bit more about why this is so important. So any organization that collects, uses, shares personal information of their clients, their customers, their employees, their partners, their volunteers, really has two key things to ensure. They have to ensure that that information is protected and secured. And then the clincher, that information is processed in a way that's consistent with expectations of the individuals whose information it is that you're collecting. And this is where things like the long privacy policy that's posted on your website that sometimes people don't read, but it's where that privacy policy contains the information of and the details of how you're processing personal information. So it's matching what you're doing with what you're saying. And this is important from a regulatory perspective, but also for a number of other perspectives as well. Before we go into why this matters, I'm just going to talk about some privacy risks so the audience can better understand, why they need to take privacy seriously. So some key privacy risks, it's all around how that personal information is used or shared. So unauthorized access to personal information is a key risk. And this could mean, having a document on a SharePoint that contains, employee salary information, but that it's not being restricted. So anyone in the organization can access that. That's unauthorized access. It also applies to things in the offline world. So think of, maybe a filing cabinet, if your organization even has those, or even a notebook, which contains details of a performance review. If that falls into the wrong hands, that is a privacy issue. Another privacy risk is the unauthorized disclosure of personal information. So that's where personal information is compromised. And that could be a result of a malicious attack like phishing, but it also can be a result of human error. In fact, again, citing the federal privacy regulator, of reports that were made to them last year, over a third of those reports of breaches were a result of human error. And this is when maybe people are emailed as a CC as opposed to a BCC, or an email with personal information is sent to the wrong person. So often I think people assume a privacy breach is, an attempt by a hacker, but in fact, human error can play a major role in a privacy breach. That's why education is so important, but we'll touch on that later. Another key privacy risk is the misuse of personal information. And this is where personal information is used for a purpose that the individual did not consent to, or nor has an expectation for their information to be used in that way. And there's a recent regulatory finding that I think highlights this quite well that I'll mention. Home Depot and Meta / Facebook got on the wrong side of Canadians when Home Depot was using any customer that had opted for like an e-receipt and provided their email to receive the receipt. They were providing that information to Meta, and they had a contract to do that. And Meta was using that information to help Home Depot with their sort of targeted advertising. But in the contract, also allowed Meta to use that customer personal information for their own purposes. And that certainly was not in line with customer expectations. So I think that's an important observation when it comes to privacy, that you have a contract or an expectation with your customers that you're going to use that information in a very specific way. And if you are going to deviate from that, you need to check some boxes to make sure that you're on the right side of your customer and the law. And why does all this matter? Why is privacy so important? Aside from the obvious, I think corporations, small or large, need to think about their reputation. And if you have a privacy breach or poor privacy practices, that can really damage your corporate reputation. It also can lead to lower employee morale, things like customer trust as well. The bottom line, money, as well as the regulatory consequences. As we'll talk about later in the presentation, some regions have fines, monetary penalties for organizations that have privacy breaches. And then, broader things like investor confidence. And I know that's not as relevant for startup communities, but it could be if you're looking to raise money. And I think we've seen so many high-profile privacy breaches that have caused a lot of chaos. I don't know where all of you are joining from today, but the Toronto Public Library had a major privacy breach last year, and that created havoc for their operations and its customers and their employees. So I think there are many, many reasons why privacy is important and should be on top list of things for you to address as a startup. So we'll move on to the next slide. And it's a common sort of question, or it's misunderstood, what's the difference between data privacy and data security? And I think different experts will have different perspectives on this. I'm going to try and simplify it to explain, how we see the key difference as we are privacy professionals. I like to say that privacy and security are siblings, they're best friends, they really need each other. And privacy really is about the words and the policies. And security, you think about a security guard, it's around protecting, protecting the data. So when we talk about privacy, we are talking about the governance, the rules, the frameworks, the guidelines that your organization can build into its privacy policies around how personal information is stored, how it's shared, how it's retained, how it's deleted. It's that whole framework that helps you define and run your privacy program. And I think I'll just pause here to talk a little bit about how a privacy program is generally structured. And Monifa is going to go into more detail, but privacy in Canada and many places is based on key principles. And just to give you an example, one key principle that helps build a privacy program is data minimization. So this is around ensuring that organizations are only collecting the minimum amount of data they require to fill the service or product. So as an example, if you're going to your bank to renew or to borrow money for a mortgage, it is legitimate and understandable that they may require certain more detailed personal information than, for example, if you're signing up for an app to get sports scores. It wouldn't be reasonable for a sports app to request your social insurance number. So I think this is a concept that is quite easy to understand and important to enforce in terms of only collecting the minimum amount of information that you require to provide your product or service. Another key privacy principle is consent. And this is where the individual who is providing their personal information, either through implied, doing a business transaction, or explicitly provides you, the organization, with consent to use their personal information for a specific purpose. So as an example, on your local coffee shop app, you're providing your tastes and preferences on what coffees you like, and you're giving consent in return for them to market to you, but you're not giving them consent for anything beyond what they have asked for in terms of consent. Two other key privacy principles include transparency, and this is an ongoing challenge where privacy policies can be very long and heavily legally worded. And this is something that we promote with our clients, is ensuring you have a privacy policy that is transparent and accessible, that your customers can clearly understand what it is that you're trying to achieve with their personal information. And many times we see privacy policies contained with legalese. And we sometimes work with our clients to strip away that and have very simplified and easy to understand privacy policies. A final privacy principle that I'll touch on is access. A lot of privacy laws provide the person whose personal information is being collected, with the right to access that information so they can understand what information an organization has on them. And we've seen this built into privacy laws globally, which we'll touch on further in the presentation. So hopefully I've explained privacy, and now I will move on to data security. And this is the practice of safeguarding the digital information that organizations collect from unauthorized access through the entire data life cycle. So from when the data is collected to when it's stored to when it's deleted. And data security is broadly structured in terms of creating addressing physical security of hardware and software and devices. It could be something like encryption, so ensuring information cannot be accessed, or that it's encrypted and safe when it's being transmitted. Data security also talks about administration controls. So this is, where you limit access. Back to the SharePoint that I referenced earlier. It's around ensuring that, only the team that needs access to that SharePoint has access, and that when someone changes a role in an organization, that access is restricted if they no longer require it. So data security isn't just about personal information. It's much broader. It's around all the digital information that is available. So in summary, privacy and security really need each other. Privacy are the rules and the guidelines, and security is about the tools and technologies that help keep data safe. So moving on to the next slide, we've got laws and regulations. And I know we're in the middle of lunch hour, so I will try not to put everyone to sleep by talking about laws and regulations. But it is kind of exciting when you look at some of the numbers. So global developments in privacy were really led by Europe. When in 2018, Europe in the EU, I've lost track of how many countries are now in the EU, maybe 26. They managed to come up with a union-wide privacy policy called the GDPR. And this has helped put privacy laws and regulations on the map. Why? Because of the fines. The GDPR, there are fines of up to 4% of annual global turnover for certain privacy breaches. So to give you a context of what this means from a financial perspective, I'm referencing Meta again. I don't mean to focus on Meta, but they often are on the wrong side of regulators. In 2023, last year, they were fined 1.2 billion euros by the Irish Data Protection Authority for transferring data of EU users to the US without having the proper safeguards in place. So these kind of figures are eye-watering and they make headlines. So after Europe, we saw many other regions and countries amend their privacy laws to have a real focus on customer rights and consumer rights. And most privacy policies now lead with that lens. And we're also seeing the introduction of many more fines. But as we're in Canada, and I assume most of the audience is in Canada, we're just going to take a step backwards from Europe and their eye-watering fines to look at what a Canadian company needs to consider when building a privacy program. So how do you know what privacy laws apply to you? Well, quickly, you have to understand the nature of your organization. Are you a federal government institution, or are you provincial or territorial government body? Are you in the private sector? Are you engaged in commercial activities? Are you federally regulated? Where's your organization based? Where are your customers based? And what type of information are you processing? So quickly, to go through the privacy laws in Canada, we have the Privacy Act, which applies to the federal public sector. So this is government institutions, crown corporations, but not political parties. And that's an ongoing issue in Canada, that political parties don't really fall under any of the existing privacy laws. And then also federally, we have PIPEDA, which applies to the private sector. From our perspective, being the privacy nerds that we are, I think the key thing you need to know about PIPEDA is that it's overdue for an upgrade. And there's currently a bill before Parliament, Bill C-27, which looks to update the private sector privacy law. And we're waiting with bated breath. They have had ongoing hearings. I think they've had over 100 witnesses testifying about the changes to PIPEDA, and they've received over 60 submissions. And interestingly, Bill C-27 also includes some AI regulation. So it's interesting that it's updating some very out-of-date regulation, but is also putting Canada on the map as a leader in AI regulation. So we'll see what happens with that. But I think as a startup, the key thing to know is that when the updates to PIPEDA finally come through, there are probably going to be some operational changes for organizations and how they process personal information. Now, provincially, there are also some provinces that have laws that have been, well, all provinces have privacy laws, but some of them have laws that have been deemed to be substantially similar and adequate to PIPEDA. So for example, in Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec, they have their own private sector privacy laws. Some provinces also have some health sector privacy laws that are deemed to be substantially similar. And I think the general trend in Canada is we're seeing more rigorous privacy regulation, and Quebec has really taken the lead on that. And I know operationally for a lot of organizations doing business in Quebec, they have had to implement changes to ensure they're on the right side of the privacy laws. And I think the key takeaway before I hand over to Monifa on this is just because you're located in one jurisdiction, it doesn't mean other privacy laws don't apply to you. It really comes down to where your customers are. And so it's very important as an organization to understand what data that you are capturing and in what jurisdictions your customers are. Thank you. Over to you, Monifa.
Thank you so much, Susie, for filling us in on everything that we need to know from a regulatory perspective. We're going to jump into talking about privacy in the workplace, which is a huge topic these days for a lot of different reasons. So when it comes to protecting employee personal information, you really have to take that into consideration with all the different types of information that can be collected. In the process of recruiting, onboarding, and maintaining employees, you will collect and process a lot of personal information about them, which can include their government-issued identifiers, payroll details, banking information, resume information, performance reviews, medical information, and so much more. As Susie previously mentioned, when you think about the information that you have about your employees, you want to limit the collection of this information to only what's necessary for its intended purpose. As an employer, you're responsible for protecting your employees' personal information using administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to protect against accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or access. Technical safeguards can include your access controls, your audit controls, transmission security, antivirus, firewalls, intrusion prevention systems. Your physical safeguards will include, managing access to certain floors or rooms, registering visitors who are coming into your location, locking your screen when you leave your desk, and appropriately storing physical documents or records according to the type of classification and sensitivity of the information. The administrative safeguards are going to include your policies, procedures, and training. So when we look over on the next slide, your employee training really is going to be the key to your success. Your administrative safeguards are dependent on effective training and awareness. Your education and awareness of your employees is vital to ensuring that they understand the importance of privacy and how to comply with privacy-specific policies and procedures that are in place. I say this all the time, but I can't stress it enough. An informed employee is the first line of defense required to protect personal information from unauthorized use or disclosure. As Susie kind of touched on before, and you see this a lot with breaches, it's not always a hacker. It really can be just, an error that's happened internally. It's not always something that's malicious. So the more training that you provide your employees, the better protected you are. Having policies and procedures that employees are not aware of and do not understand can leave your organization exposed. So when we look at privacy trends in the workplace, a hot topic that I know is probably on the minds of everyone, and you really can't escape this no matter where you go, is artificial intelligence. The introduction of AI, or large language models, also known as LLMs, can raise concerns about how data, specifically personal information, is collected, stored, and used. It's important that you conduct privacy impact assessments and/or algorithmic impact assessments as you're introducing these new technologies. Whether you're a developer or a company implementing these solutions, you have to have an increased focus on privacy by design, which involves integrating data privacy controls and compliance into the design stage of these solutions and technologies. The use of AI and LLMs can also bring challenges such as potential bias in automated decision-making, risk of re-identification in anonymized data, and issues of consent and transparency. Continuous monitoring and updating of your privacy policies and practices are needed to address these concerns. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada published an article back in December of 2023 outlining various principles for the development, provision, and use of generative AI systems. These principles include making sure that you have legal authority and consent, appropriate purpose, necessity and proportionality, openness, accountability, provide individual access, limit collection, use, and disclosure, accuracy, and safeguards are in place. In a recent case, Moffat versus Air Canada, the case focused on whether or not the company could be held liable for incorrect information that was provided by one of its AI chatbots online. The case actually concluded that Air Canada was liable for the misinformation provided by its chatbot. So I bring this case up as an example to demonstrate why whenever you're implementing any type of new technology solutions, specifically in the AI space, you can be accountable for what this solution is putting out into the public domain. So you want to make sure that you really are taking a look at the principles that have been provided by the Privacy Commissioner, specifically around, your accountability, making sure that your information is accurate. What kind of testing are you doing? This is another example of kind of like I said before, having a privacy impact assessment and doing an algorithmic impact assessment. You want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence in testing this technology before you're putting it out there in the public space. Another trend about privacy, and this is one that comes up quite often, is employee monitoring. Companies need to manage and maintain their business operations, which to some extent does mean that you're going to monitor your employees. It doesn't, however, erase your employees' right to privacy in the workplace. It's important to comply with data privacy principles when implementing any monitoring practices. It's especially important as it relates to the collection of biometric data. So a term that you hear often from the Privacy Commissioner is that you should conduct a reasonable person test. And what does that mean? It means you should be asking yourself, is it necessary? Is it reasonable? Is it effective? And is there a less intrusive or a less invasive alternative? So I wanted to share a few case studies that came out of the Privacy Commissioner where they shared their own findings of examples where companies had gone too far when it came to employee monitoring and they weren't respecting employee privacy. So this is in a case from 2022. The employer had installed a dash camera into a vehicle that was continuously monitoring audio as well as video without the employee's consent. It was identified during the investigation that this recording was actually going on regardless of whether the car was driving or idle. So it could have been active even when the driver was off duty. In this case, the commissioner found that the continuous monitoring of employees resulted in the loss of privacy that was disproportionate to the benefits actually being gained by the employer. So the company could have achieved the objectives that they wanted to in a much less privacy intrusive manner. So they were ordered to update or was recommended that they needed to update the system and make sure that they were only recording during the timeframes that they needed to be recording. Another example from the Privacy Commissioner, and this one is specific to the Privacy Act, which is our public, so our government institutions. In this case, the government department was using surveillance cameras to track employee attendance in the workplace. Following the investigation, it identified that the privacy policy didn't identify this purpose in this use case for the use of surveillance cameras. So they actually needed to find less intrusive measures in regards to how they were going to track employee attendance. So these examples really just serve as reminders of the importance of building privacy by design into any technology or processes that you're going to put in place when monitoring your employees, because it's important that you meet your business objectives for sure, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that actually respects the privacy of your employees as well. So let's switch gears and turn to the building blocks of a privacy program. Every organization that is subject to Canada's private sector privacy laws must comply with them. Establishing a privacy framework is a way for organizations to satisfy regulators and be confident that you are being compliant with these regulations. Additionally, as Susie mentioned, studies are showing that Canadians are increasingly concerned about their privacy. More and more, they're choosing to do business with organizations that are sensitive to those concerns and that can demonstrate that they will handle personal information with care. So our privacy framework building blocks, These blocks we find are effective for small and medium-sized business as well as startup organizations. So there's a few of them, and bear with me. So the very first step is accountability. You want to make sure that you have assigned accountability within your organization by appointing someone to be responsible for compliance with data privacy laws and regulations. Depending on the size of your organization, you can assign somebody internally or externally. Data mapping is also really important. You want to know what data your company collects and how it's used, stored, and generally processed for its full life cycle. Laws and regulations, as Susie mentioned before, you got to know what laws apply based on where you operate, how you operate, where are you located versus where your data subject's located. And this kind of ties back into your data mapping. Once you know what data you have, that's how you can really better understand what are the laws that are going to apply to you and how do they shape the structure of your business and your policies. You also really need to understand, are you collecting personal information, personal health information? Are you collecting information related to minors? These also play a role in, the sensitivity of the information and any additional regulations that might apply to you. Then you'll definitely want to think about your public-facing privacy policy. Susie joked before that this is usually that really long policy on your website that a lot of people don't read. It's important that you're transparent about your data practices and that you have transparent notices in place before you process information. Consent is another really big one. Do you have the consent to collect and process the information that you are processing? So you want to make sure that you've got that right structure in place. Your internal privacy policies and procedures. You've got to define and enforce the data privacy and compliance within your organization. You'll want to make sure that your internal privacy policies and procedures align with that public-facing privacy policy that you have. So whatever you're stating publicly in regards to how you're protecting personal information, you want to make sure that you've got the right structure internally to support that. Security safeguards and controls. You want to implement security measures that align with the sensitivity of data. You got to protect personal information at all times, but especially if you're going to be transferring data across borders. You might also want to think about having a cyber insurance policy, because this can help organizations pay for any financial losses that can be faced if you are subject to a cyber attack or any type of data breach. It can help you cover costs related to remediation, paying for an investigation, crisis communication, any legal services, and potentially also refunds to customers based on, whatever the extent of that situation might be. You've also got to think about breach management. The laws require reporting breaches of security safeguards that result in a real risk of significant harm. So to comply, you've got to make sure that you establish a breach management procedure and ensure that breaches are identified, investigated, and reported if required. And again, I stress this all the time, but employee training and awareness. Your privacy training can help ensure that your employees understand how to appropriately process personal information. They can help you to, having an effective training model can help you to prevent phishing attacks, identify social engineering, and ultimately protect personal information. And last but not least, you want to make sure that you're assessing your third parties. If you share information with third parties who are accountable for processing information on your behalf, you want to make sure that you have done your due diligence in vetting them before you actually share personal information. You want to know about their own privacy posture, their own security structure, to make sure that you're entrusting it to somebody who's going to protect that information the same way that you would. So these building blocks might appear to be a lot, and it can sound really overwhelming. But depending on the size and structure and the complexity of your organization, it kind of changes the way that these frameworks will build out. They might have to be more robust depending on the size of and scope of your organization. There are lots of publicly available resources to help kind of guide organizations through where to get started. And the team here at Garabyte obviously is always available to support as needed. Next slide, please. Over to you, Susie.
Thanks, Monifa. I know we're getting some good questions in the chat, so I think we'll just run through the key takeaways and then we will move on to the questions. To summarize all of this information that we've just unloaded to you in a short period of time, we wanted to give you some key high-level takeaways that you can use to help you operationalize and bring privacy within your workplace. The first thing is, know what personal information you have. And Monifa referred to data mapping. It doesn't have to be that complicated, but if you're collecting personal information, you should have a list of what you're collecting somewhere, even if you're the smallest organization. 2, you need to understand what rules apply to you, because if you don't know what rules apply, you don't know what rules that you're breaking. So that is very important. Again, as Monifa mentioned, education, training, and awareness. You need to educate yourself and your employees on key privacy takeaways and risks. You need to seek support. Most startups don't have, a privacy officer or someone who wears that privacy hat. We've listed some resources at the end of this presentation, which might be helpful for you to seek support and ask for help. Unfortunately, you kind of have to prepare for the worst case scenario. And this is, a privacy breach that could, harm your organization. And if you can prepare for it and be ready for it, hopefully, if God forbid something happens, you can minimize, the operational downtime and the risk to your brand and your business. And then stay abreast of trends. There are lots of online resources out there which talk about new privacy technologies, trends in use of personal information, etc. So, sign up for those privacy newsletters to make sure that you aren't missing out on developments within privacy. So I think at this point, we'll turn over to the Q&A. And as I mentioned, I've seen a number of Q&A in the messaging. So I think we'll go to that and I can read out the questions and then Monifa and I can jointly approach and answer them. So Marion, you asked about how do you convince your board, being a nonprofit, of the importance of privacy protections. That's a really good question. And it can be a challenge, especially if you're a not-for-profit and you have limited budget and resource. I think the key things that I would say there is, don't go presenting the world. Go with a proposal on how you can approach privacy in a budget-friendly way. And we've tried to put this in the presentation. You don't have to do everything all at once, but maybe you address the key, most important thing at the outset, and then give your board a bit of a roadmap of what you propose to invest, maybe over a 3 to 5 year period, so it doesn't intimidate them. And I think the other point I would suggest before handing over to Monifa is headlines. Headlines always scare people. Educate your board so they understand the risks of not having strong privacy protections in place. Monifa, would you add to that response at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything that you've said. Another thing that's important for the use case when you're talking about the board really is helping them understand, what happens if you aren't being compliant. Depending on where you operate, as an example, like if you're operating in Quebec right now, the privacy regulations do apply to you there, even if you're a not-for-profit. Whereas, in other places in the country right now, it might not apply to you because you're not operating in a commercial space. So it really depends on where you're operating. If you are in a province where it's not necessarily a concern for you right now, as Susie mentioned, you do have the opportunity to think longer term about how you can start to put things in place slowly over that period of time to really ramp yourself up and make sure that you're ready when the regulations do change.
So I'll read out the next question from Nairobi. How often do privacy laws change, and what is a typical annual budget companies should have to maintain their updates with data privacy? Ooh, well, privacy laws do not change very often. Often developments in laws and regulations can't keep up with technology, so they don't change often. In terms of typical budget, that's a very hard one to answer, not being aware of how large your organization is. Obviously, I think the main point I'd say is the more personal information you manage, the more sensitive it is, you would see a corresponding increase in budget. So I think it's proportionate to that, but I don't think there's an annual budget. It really depends on the size of the organization and the data that's involved. Monifa?
To add to that, I would also say it also is going to depend on where you are in your privacy journey. Do you already have some of your framework in place, or are you starting at a place where there's nothing in place? So are you making updates versus are you trying to build everything from scratch? If you're in a space where you're just trying to put things into place now, there's definitely going to be more cost up front to build your program. Like, again, as Susie mentioned, that's something that can be spread over time, but it really depends on where you are in your journey. Are you making updates and just kind of keeping pace with what's going on with technology and the changes in your organization? Or are you truly trying to build everything from scratch?
And I see, Nairobi, you're asking for a general starting range as an estimate. You can contact us offline and we can have that conversation so we can better understand your organization, because I don't want to give a number and intimidate anyone, because it really does depend on the size of the organization and all the points that Monifa raised. And again, if we service different provinces or countries, how do we ensure covering all the laws that apply? Well, I think we've touched on that. You need to map out what the requirements are for each jurisdiction to ensure you're complying with it. And that's really sort of, a desk research or function to understand that. And, Google can be your best friend in that. Monifa, would you add to that?
Yeah, I'd also say one of the approaches that you might want to think about when you're multi-jurisdictional is, once you actually know, okay, these are all the regulations I need to comply with, what's the highest bar? Look at what's the highest bar across all your jurisdictions. And if you can make sure that you're always meeting the highest bar, then you're definitely going to be able to satisfy everything. But to Susie's point, you definitely have to start with knowing first what are those regulations.
And we've been asked to plug other people's businesses. Do we have any recommendations for companies providing data internet security? There are lots of companies out there, but I don't think we're in a position to name or recommend any of those. So let's see, we've got another question here, and then we had some that came in before, but Dr. Vibe is asking if we provide training for companies and their employees. Absolutely, yes, we do. And we're happy to talk to anyone more about the training that we can provide. I believe in business insurance covers some of this stuff. Has this been your experience? It depends on your insurance policy, but a lot of insurance policies now do have some sort of cyber protection component. So yes, I've seen that before. Now, should I just move? I think I might just move to some of the questions that we got before the presentation, because I know we're coming close to time. Someone provided a question around, can I copy a privacy policy from someone in the same industry? That's probably really tempting. And what I would say is that your privacy policy needs to reflect what personal information you're collecting and how you're using it. So while many privacy policies have the same template and they cover the same principles, I imagine every organization has a unique and specific approach to what personal information they process. So policies, I think, need to be tailored for specific businesses. Monifa, would you add at all to that?
Yeah, I'd say definitely you hit everything on the nail right there. And I think it's also important for organizations to think about can you actually hold yourself accountable to what's stated in that policy? When we talk about the safeguards and transferring information, and how you're protecting that information internally, how long you're retaining it, all those things, before you think about copying a privacy policy, you really need to ask yourself, are these measures that you're able to demonstrate you comply with? And if they're not, then you definitely want to make sure you have a policy that's tailored to what's actually happening within your organization.
I see another question in the chat from Marion. LPG is international. We are in Ghana where biometrics are used. What is your position on this factor? So I'm not sure if you're saying that your organization uses biometrics or if biometrics are used in Ghana. I mean, biometrics, the personal information. So, what I would say to that is you need to ensure that your customers or whoever's biometric information you're collecting is used in accordance with the laws and in accordance with your privacy policy. Monifa, I don't know if you would add anything to that.
Yeah, so definitely. And I believe Marion had asked the question at the top about making sure that privacy, like how to sell privacy to the board, or getting them on board with a privacy policy. So again, you have to know the regulations and the jurisdiction of whose biometric data you're actually collecting. So you've got to know what regulations actually apply to you, but especially if you're going to be collecting biometric data that is incredibly sensitive, you want to make sure that you are working with the right security safeguards to protect that information, but that you also have the right policies and procedures internally to govern how that information is being collected, how it's being stored, processed. You don't want to be on the wrong side of what can happen if it's not correctly protected.
And there was a final question that came to us before, impact of AI on privacy. Where do we start on that one? That's a whole other, I think, webinar. The impact is endless. It's a conversation we could have for a long time. So I think that is too big of a topic to get to when we have 2 minutes left. But just to say, there are lots of great media articles out there, lots of great podcasts, and it's ever evolving, and it's a really interesting area with lots of positives, but maybe also some not so positives. I don't know, Monifa, if you would say anything else on that one.
I think you've definitely covered it. I've been listening to a lot of great podcasts just talking about the advancements of artificial intelligence and kind of what some of the pros and the cons are going to be. And it's definitely going to be an interesting next few years.
Yeah. Which I think is a great segue to this useful resources. So we've just put some websites together of organizations that we follow that have the latest sort of on the policy regulatory developments as it comes to privacy and new technologies. So hopefully you will find those useful. And I think we have 1 minute left. So I would like to say thank you so much for your time, and please reach out to Monifa or I if you have any follow-up questions. Monifa, any final words?
No, I just want to thank everyone for spending their lunch hour with us today.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Susie and Monifa. That was great. Thank you for your time. And if, like Susie mentioned, if anyone on the call would like to connect with Susie or Monifa, please reach out to myself or Alex. So I'm just pasting our email addresses in the chat box. You could just reach out to us and we would do our best to walk you through the different options for an introduction to Susie or Monifa. Before you disappear, I've also posted a feedback form link in the chat. Please click on it and share your thoughts on this session and on the Toolkit Tuesday series in general. If there's a topic you'd like us to present on, please let us know. Feel free to also follow us on social media and tweet or post about your experience with us. We'll be mailing out a copy of this presentation and any supporting documents, as well as a link to the replay of the session today in about 48 hours from now. The presentation will also be posted on YouTube for your future viewing needs. In the meantime, please reach out if you need anything. So a sincere thank you once again to Susie and Monifa, to our sign interpreters, Jennifer and Samantha, to our sponsors, to Alex, and to all of you. Thanks very much for being here today. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.